The date is March 27, 1988. WrestleMania IV. Randy Savage is the new World Wrestling Federation champion. Hogan enters the ring to celebrate. He and Savage embrace. Miss Elizabeth joins them. The three of them stand together as the crowd roars its approval. This moment marks the official birth of the Mega Powers. The World Wrestling Federation stands at the absolute peak of its power. The company has achieved things that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Wrestling has become mainstream entertainment. Hulk Hogan has become a genuine American icon. Money flows in from every direction. But buried within this triumph lies a hidden curse. The very things that made 1988 so successful would later bring the company to its knees. The choices made during this year of celebration would haunt WWE for almost a decade. To understand the curse, you first need to understand just how big the World Wrestling Federation became that year. The year 1988 represented everything Vince McMahon had dreamed wrestling could become. 3 weeks before WrestleMania, the company had achieved something remarkable. The main event aired live on NBC in prime time on February 5th. This was not late-night cable programming. This was network television on a Friday evening, competing directly with everything else America wanted to watch. The show featured a rematch between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant from their legendary WrestleMania III battle the previous year. That earlier match had drawn over 93,000 fans to the Pontiac Silverdome, setting an attendance record that stood for decades. The television rematch promised similar drama. The broadcast pulled a 15.2 rating and drew somewhere between 26 and 28 million viewers, though some newspapers at the time reported 33 million. The exact number remains debated among historians, but either way, it stands as the highest-rated wrestling program in American television history. To put this in perspective, that audience equals or exceeds most regular season NFL games in prime time today. The match itself featured one of the most controversial finishes in wrestling history. Referee Dave Hebner was supposed to officiate, but his identical twin brother Earl Hebner secretly took his place. When Andre delivered a belly-to-belly suplex on Hogan, Earl made a fast 3 count, even though Hogan's shoulder was clearly off the mat before the count reached 2. Andre won the match and became WWE champion, but immediately after, he handed the title to the Million Dollar Man, who had orchestrated the entire scheme. The plan was for Ted to buy the championship through Andre. WWE President Jack Tunney intervened. He ruled that a championship cannot be sold or surrendered voluntarily. He stripped Andre of the title and declared it vacant. This set up the 14-man tournament at WrestleMania IV. The storyline was insane. The finish was controversial. Fans were outraged, and they absolutely loved it. This is what WWE had become in 1988. A company that could generate genuine mainstream attention. A company that could get 26 million people to watch a wrestling match on network television. A company that had figured out how to turn professional wrestling into must-see entertainment. The Saturday night main event specials continued to dominate their time slot on NBC. These shows aired every few months in late night, featuring major matches and advancing key storylines. The March 1987 episode had drawn an 11.6 rating, the highest ever achieved in that time slot by any program. The 1988 episodes continued to perform strongly. House show attendance reached levels that modern promoters can only dream about. WWE ran hundreds of live events every year across the United States and Canada. Fans packed arenas to see their heroes in action. These shows generated consistent revenue that formed the backbone of the company's finances. Merchandise sales broke records left and right. WWE had transformed itself into a licensing machine. They sold action figures featuring every major wrestler. They sold t-shirts, hats, and foam fingers. They sold lunchboxes that kids brought to school. They even sold ice cream bars with Hulk Hogan's face on the wrapper. Walk into any playground in America during 1988, and you would find kids copying Hulk Hogan. They struck his poses. They flexed their arms. They pointed to the sky. They cupped their hands to their ears. They told their friends to say their prayers, take their vitamins, and believe in themselves. The Hulkamania phenomenon had penetrated American culture in ways that went far beyond wrestling fans. Hulk Hogan himself had become a genuine celebrity. He appeared on magazine covers that had nothing to do with wrestling. Talk shows competed to book him as a guest. He had already starred in Rocky III as Thunderlips and would continue pursuing acting opportunities. The man was one of the most recognizable faces in America. Vince McMahon had done what many said could never happen. He had taken professional wrestling, long dismissed as lowbrow entertainment for rural audiences, and made it acceptable to the masses. He had created a new form of entertainment that combined athletics with theater, good versus evil storytelling with physical competition, and he had made it work on a scale nobody thought possible. The tournament at WrestleMania IV seemed to prove the formula was perfect. Take your most charismatic performers. Put them in dramatic situations. Tell stories that capture the imagination. Let the money flow. The formation of the Mega Powers gave the company its biggest storyline ever. Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage together represented the two most popular wrestlers in the world. They had actually formed their alliance back in October 1987, during the October 3rd taping of Saturday night's Main Event that aired on NBC. Savage was pursuing the Intercontinental Championship held by the Honky Tonk Man. During his match with Honky, the Hart Foundation attacked Savage. They beat him down while Honky completed his assault. Miss Elizabeth, Savage's manager and real-life wife, ran backstage in desperation. When she returned, she had Hulk Hogan with her. Hogan cleared the ring. He saved Savage from further punishment. The two men shook hands. Later that night, in a backstage interview with Gene Okerlund, Savage declared that the combination of Hulkamania and Macho Madness would become the most powerful force in WWE history. The Mega Powers were born. WrestleMania IV made the partnership official and put the championship on Savage. Now the two biggest stars in wrestling were aligned. They could face any challenge together. They could draw money anywhere in the world. Their first major test as an official team came at the first ever SummerSlam in August 1988 at Madison Square Garden. WWE created this event to establish a major summer pay-per-view alongside WrestleMania. The Mega Powers faced the Mega Bucks, the Million Dollar Man and Andre the Giant, the same villains who had tried to steal the championship earlier that year. Jesse Ventura served as special guest referee. The match drew a sellout crowd of 20,000 fans. The Garden was electric. The match went back and forth with both teams gaining advantage. Then, Miss Elizabeth played her key role. At a crucial moment, she climbed onto the ring apron and removed her skirt, revealing a bikini bottom underneath. The distraction caused the Million Dollar Man and Andre to stare in shock. This gave the Mega Powers the opening they needed. Hogan delivered his leg drop. The referee counted 3. The good guys won. The moment became one of the most talked about events of the year. Elizabeth in her bikini, the Garden erupting, Hogan and Savage celebrating together. It was sports entertainment at its finest. At the Survivor Series in November 1988, the Mega Powers continued their dominance. They led a team that included Hercules, Coco Beware, and Hillbilly Jim against a team captained by the Twin Towers, Akeem and Big Boss Man, alongside the Million Dollar Man, Haku, and the Red Rooster. Hogan and Savage were the sole survivors, defeating the entire opposing team. Everything seemed to be working. Every gamble paid off. Every choice yielded gold. WWE appeared immune to the normal rules of business. They had found the magic formula, and it seemed like nothing could stop them. But success can be a dangerous thing. When everything works, you stop asking hard questions. You stop preparing for what happens when things go wrong. You start believing that your success is permanent rather than something that requires constant effort to maintain. This is where the curse begins. The most basic problem WWE created in 1988 was their complete reliance on one man. Every major storyline revolved around Hulk Hogan. Even Randy Savage's championship reign existed largely in Hogan's shadow. Savage held the belt, but the narrative always came back to Hogan. Every angle somehow connected to the Hulkster. Consider the WrestleMania IV tournament itself. Hogan received a bye to the quarterfinals, where he faced Andre the Giant in a rematch of their famous WrestleMania III encounter. They fought to a double disqualification when both men used steel chairs, eliminating them both. But the elimination actually helped Savage by giving the $1 Million Man a bye to the finals with a tired opponent. It also kept the focus on Hogan even when he lost. The whole point of the Mega Powers was that Savage needed Hogan. The champion needed the former champion standing behind him. That message, intentional or not, told fans that Savage alone was not enough to carry the company. This was not some evil conspiracy against Savage. It was simply how the company had learned to do business. Hulk Hogan was the biggest draw in wrestling history. Everything worked better when Hogan was involved, so they involved him in everything. Hogan's first reign as WWE champion had lasted an incredible 1,474 days, from January 1984 through February 1988. That is the third longest reign in the championship's history. For 4 years, every major program in the company revolved around Hogan defending the title or pursuing villains who threatened his position. When Hogan was not champion, he was still the focal point. His rematch with Andre, his rescue of Savage, his presence at ringside for the championship match, his celebration in the ring afterward. The cameras followed Hogan wherever he went because that is where the audience wanted to look. The problem was sustainability. Nobody asked what would happen when Hogan got older. He was already 34 years old in 1988, with years of wear and tear on his body from the demanding schedule. His knees were damaged from countless leg drops. His back ached from carrying opponents through matches night after night. Nobody asked what would happen if Hogan got hurt. A serious injury could sideline him for months. The company had no plan for that possibility. They simply assumed Hogan would always be available. Nobody asked what would happen if fans simply got tired of seeing the same thing over and over. Hogan had been on top since 1984. 4 years is a long time to maintain the same act. Eventually, even the most popular performer wears out his welcome. Andre the Giant's decline had already shown the danger of depending on one man. Andre's health had been failing for years due to acromegaly, the condition that caused his gigantism. The disease was slowly killing him. His mobility had decreased dramatically. He could no longer perform the athletic moves he had done in his younger days. When Andre could no longer perform at main event level, WWE had nobody else who could challenge Hogan credibly. Andre had been built as the one monster who could threaten Hulkamania. Without Andre, who else was there? They had supporting players, they had mid-card talent, they had excellent performers like Jake Roberts and Rick Rude and the $1 Million Man. But they had no genuine alternative to Hogan at the top. Nobody had been built to that level. Everyone in the company existed to make Hogan look strong. Everyone was built up just enough to be a believable opponent before losing to him. Everyone orbited around Hogan's son. The tag team division thrived with teams like Demolition, Strikeforce, and the Hart Foundation. The Intercontinental Championship scene produced good matches. But none of this mattered as much as what Hogan was doing. The supporting players were supporting players by design. In 1988, this seemed like smart business. Why change what works? Hogan drew money. Hogan moved merchandise. Hogan attracted mainstream attention. Building everything around him made sense from a short-term perspective, but looking back, it was organizational suicide on an installment plan. WWE was building a house on a foundation that could not last forever. Hogan would eventually leave, or slow down, or become less popular. When that happened, the company would have nothing to fall back on. They were not developing the next generation of stars. They were not creating backup plans. They were not thinking about what the company would look like in 5 or 10 years. They were too focused on what was working right now. The year 1988 turned the Hogan formula into law. Wrestling historians know the pattern well. It appeared in virtually every Hulk Hogan main event match throughout the 1980s. The structure was so consistent that fans could predict it before the bell rang. First, the babyface hero starts strong. He dominates the early portion of the match with punches, body slams, and Irish whips, He shows the audience that he is the superior competitor. Then the tide turns. The villain gains the advantage, often through cheating or outside interference. The hero gets beaten down. He absorbs punishment from the villain. Headlocks, body shots, submission holds. The crowd grows nervous. The hero tries to mount comebacks but gets cut off. The villain taunts him and taunts the crowd. He goes for his finishing move. It connects. The referee counts. 1, 2. But the hero kicks out at the last moment. And now something changes. The hero begins shaking. His body trembles. His eyes widen. He points his finger at the villain. The crowd goes crazy because they know what is coming. He hulks up. The villain's punches no longer hurt him. He shakes them off. He absorbs blow after blow without flinching. He wags his finger in the villain's face. No more. He fires back with his own punches. Each one sends the villain reeling. He bounces off the ropes. Big boot to the face. The villain goes down. He bounces off the ropes again. Leg drop across the throat. The villain is finished. 1, 2, 3. The hero poses for the fans while his music plays. Good has triumphed over evil. The American way has prevailed. The children in the audience go home happy. This formula worked brilliantly from 1984 through 1987. It helped Hogan become the biggest star in wrestling. It gave fans exactly what they wanted to see. It was simple, effective, and incredibly over with audiences. But by 1988, it was starting to calcify into the only acceptable way to book a main event. Fans were beginning to see the pattern, even if they did not think about it consciously. They knew Hogan would get beaten down. They knew he would hulk up. They knew he would hit the boot and the leg drop. They knew he would win. The only question was how long the beating would last before the inevitable comeback. The matches became predictable. You knew how they would end before they started. The journey was always the same even when the opponent changed. Whether Hogan faced Andre, Bundy, Savage as a villain, or anyone else, the structure remained identical. More importantly, the formula constrained everyone else on the roster. Other wrestlers were not allowed to develop their own distinct styles or storytelling approaches. They had to fit into supporting roles within Hogan's narrative. There was no room for experimentation or evolution. Randy Savage was one of the most creative performers in wrestling history. His matches with Ricky Steamboat at WrestleMania III showed what was possible when two talented workers were given time to tell a complex story. That match is still regarded as one of the greatest of all time. But as WWE champion in 1988, Savage was not allowed to showcase that creativity in the main event. His matches had to fit the formula. His championship reign existed within the Mega Powers storyline, which meant his individual achievements were always connected to Hogan's presence. Jake Roberts was a master of psychological storytelling. His promos were poetic and disturbing. His matches built slowly to explosive conclusions. He represented a different approach to professional wrestling, one based on characters and mind games rather than pure heroic triumph. But Roberts was kept in the mid-card because his style did not fit the formula. He was not meant to main event in the Hogan era. His talents were useful for building up villains or providing entertaining undercard matches, not for carrying the company. The company had found something that worked, and they refused to try anything different. In the short term, this seemed reasonable. Why risk changing a winning formula? Why experiment when the current approach was generating record business? Innovation could backfire. Sticking with what worked was the safe choice. But in the long term, it made the product stale. Fans eventually want to see something new. They want surprises. They want to feel like anything can happen. They want matches where the outcome is genuinely in doubt. WWE of 1988 offered no surprises. They offered the same match, with the same structure, with the same ending, repeated over and over again. The formula that had seemed fresh in 1984 was becoming tired by 1988. They would ride this approach straight into the mid-1990s, when it stopped working entirely. By then, fans had grown so bored with the predictable formula that they abandoned the product in droves. The company would have to completely reinvent itself just to survive. So all of that could be traced back to 1988, the year they stopped evolving. The most successful storyline of 1988 contained its own built-in destruction. The Mega Powers angle began with Hogan and Savage as partners and friends. Together, they represented the two biggest babyfaces in the company. Together, they were invincible. Together, they drew money everywhere they appeared. But from the very start, hints of trouble appeared. The writers planted seeds of jealousy in Savage's character. This was intentional. They knew where the story was going. They knew how it would end. The story revolved around Miss Elizabeth. Elizabeth was more than just a manager. She was Randy Savage's real-life wife, though WWE portrayed her as his girlfriend on screen. She was beautiful, kind, and sympathetic. Fans adored her. She represented the emotional heart of the Mega Powers. Both Hogan and Savage interacted with Elizabeth on screen. They protected her from villains. They celebrated victories with her. They posed for photos with her between them. Savage's character began to notice things. He noticed how Hogan looked at Elizabeth. He noticed how Elizabeth looked at Hogan. He noticed how they touched each other during celebrations. He noticed how Hogan always seemed to be around his woman. The jealousy angle was brilliant short-term storytelling. It created tension where there should have been harmony. It made fans wonder what would happen next. It added dramatic stakes to every Mega Powers appearance. Would this be the night Savage snapped? The cracks began showing at the 1988 Survivor Series in November. During the elimination match, the teams battled back and forth. At one point, Miss Elizabeth found herself in a threatening situation near the ring. Hogan acted to protect her, which was the natural thing for a hero to do, but his protection involved physical contact with Elizabeth. And Savage noticed. After Hogan eliminated Haku with his leg drop to win the match, he began celebrating. He grabbed Elizabeth in the celebration, being friendly and happy as you would expect after a victory. Savage's expression changed. His eyes narrowed. Something shifted behind them. Color commentator Jesse Ventura picked up on the tension immediately. Ventura, who played a heel announcer and often criticized the babyfaces, suggested that Savage should be concerned about Hogan's behavior around Elizabeth. He planted the seeds of doubt directly for the television audience. Savage later did a backstage interview where his displeasure was obvious. The Mega Powers were still together, but cracks had formed in the foundation. The fuse had been lit. At the 1989 Royal Rumble in January, the situation escalated. During the Royal Rumble match itself, Hogan accidentally eliminated Savage from the ring while trying to eliminate Bad News Brown. Hogan did not mean to do it. He was focused on Brown and did not realize Savage was in the way. But the result was the same. Savage was eliminated because of Hogan. Savage was furious. He confronted Hogan at ringside. Elizabeth had to step between them. She pleaded with both men. She reminded them of their friendship, their partnership, their shared victories. Eventually, Savage calmed down. He and Hogan shook hands. They agreed it was an accident. The Mega Powers appeared to survive the crisis. But the trust had been damaged, and everyone watching knew that worse was coming. Everything exploded at the Main Event 2 on February 3, 1989. The show aired live on NBC in prime time, drawing 19.9 million viewers and an 11.6 rating. The Mega Powers faced the Twin Towers, Akeem, and Big Boss Man in a tag team match. The match built toward a climactic moment. Akeem threw Savage toward the corner of the ring. Savage collided with Elizabeth, who had been standing on the ring apron. The impact knocked her unconscious. Elizabeth lay motionless outside the ring. Hogan saw what happened. Without hesitation, he picked Elizabeth up and carried her backstage to get medical attention. This was the heroic thing to do. Any decent person would want to help an injured woman. But it meant Hogan abandoned Savage in the middle of the match. Savage was left alone to face both Twin Towers. He had no partner. He had no help. He was vulnerable. When Hogan finally returned, Savage had survived through sheer determination, but he was not grateful for Hogan's return. He was enraged. Savage slapped Hogan across the face. The crowd gasped. The Mega Powers were finished. Savage grabbed WWE Championship belt, his championship belt, and used it to attack Hogan. He beat Hogan down in the ring while the Twin Towers watched in confused delight. Savage was turning villain right before everyone's eyes. Elizabeth returned, recovered from her earlier injury. Savage ignored her. He was beyond reason. His jealousy had consumed him. The angle was executed perfectly. The build had taken over a year. Every hint, every glance, every suspicious moment had led to this explosion. Fans had watched the tension escalate month after month. Now it all paid off in one devastating moment. Hogan versus Savage at WrestleMania V was set. All of this was planned from the beginning. The company knew where the story was going when they formed the Mega Powers. They knew Savage would eventually turn villain. They knew the jealousy angle would lead to their breakup. They knew Hogan and Savage would face each other at WrestleMania. And it worked. WrestleMania V on April 2, 1989 drew massive business. The match went 17 minutes. Hogan defeated Savage to regain WWE Championship. The story concluded with the hero triumphant and the jealous villain defeated. But then what? The company had willingly fractured its most popular act with no clear plan for what came next. They had spent their biggest bullet. Hogan and Savage could not keep fighting each other forever. One match, maybe a rematch. Then what? The roster had been structured so completely around these two men that nobody else was ready to step up. Who would challenge Hogan now? Who could credibly threaten his championship? The company had spent 1988 making sure nobody else reached main event level. This is what happens when you sacrifice long-term stability for short-term gains. The WrestleMania V quarterly report looked spectacular. The next year looked uncertain. The year after that looked barren. Perhaps the most harmful legacy of 1988 involved the bodies on display. The physical look of wrestlers in this era reached extreme levels. Massive muscles, impossibly wide shoulders, chests that seemed carved from stone, physiques that seemed to come from comic books rather than reality. The company made clear that size mattered above almost everything else. Hulk Hogan set the template. His 24-inch biceps and broad frame defined what a wrestling star should look like. Every aspiring main eventer needed to approximate that look or face questions about whether they could be taken seriously. The Ultimate Warrior's push began in 1988, and he represented the logical endpoint of this philosophy. Warrior, real name Jim Hellwig, had started his wrestling career in 1985 as part of a tag team called the Blade Runners alongside a young Steve Borden, later known as Sting. The team was essentially a Road Warriors knockoff, with both men sporting huge physiques and intense energy. Warrior joined WWE in 1987 and gained major momentum the following year. His look was extraordinary even by the standards of the era. Massive muscles covered every inch of his frame. Face paint gave him a wild, primal appearance. His ring entrance featured him sprinting to the ring at full speed, shaking the ropes with seemingly superhuman energy. At WrestleMania IV, Warrior defeated Hercules in his pay-per-view debut. The match was short, as most Warrior matches were. His style did not allow for long, technical contests. He overwhelmed opponents with power and intensity, then pinned them quickly. Then came SummerSlam, 1988. Brutus Beefcake was scheduled to challenge Honky Tonk Man for the Intercontinental Championship. But Beefcake was attacked by Ron Bass before the event, suffering a kayfabe injury that kept him off the show. The Intercontinental Championship had been held by Honky Tonk Man for 454 days, the longest reign in the title's history to that point. Honky was a cowardly heel who retained through cheating, interference, and intentional disqualifications. Fans desperately wanted to see him lose the belt. With Beefcake out, Honky appeared in the ring at SummerSlam and demanded any challenger. He thought he was safe. He thought nobody would accept. The Ultimate Warrior's music hit. The crowd exploded. Warrior sprinted to the ring. The match lasted exactly 27 seconds. Warrior hit a shoulder tackle, a clothesline, a big splash, and pinned Honky to win the Intercontinental Championship. The moment was perfect. The fans went crazy. Warrior had arrived as a top-tier star. But the match also revealed something important. Warrior's style was built entirely around short, explosive performances. He could not work long matches because his cardio was limited despite his muscular frame. He lacked technical wrestling ability. He relied on sheer intensity and physicality to get through his bouts. This was acceptable when he was a mid-carder having 5-minute matches. It became a problem when he was positioned as a future world champion who needed to carry main events. The company was establishing a precedent with Warriors push. To matter in WWE, you needed to look like a cartoon superhero. The bigger, the better. Technical skill was secondary. Character development was secondary. Promo ability was secondary. The body came first. This created a culture where appearance trumped almost every other consideration. Wrestlers felt pressure to achieve physiques that were often impossible without chemical assistance. The health consequences were ignored because the visual impact was so powerful. Dr. George Zahorian was a Pennsylvania urologist who worked as a ringside physician for WWE throughout the 1980s. He attended wrestling events across the region and developed relationships with the wrestlers he treated. Zahorian was also supplying steroids and other drugs to WWE performers. He had access to the locker room. He knew what the performers needed to achieve the look the company demanded. He provided it through prescriptions and direct sales. In his later testimony, Zahorian described being amazed by the wrestlers he met. He had admired them from watching television as a fan. Meeting them in person, examining them as a doctor, he realized they were human beings doing an incredibly demanding job. He also realized what they were doing to their bodies to maintain their appearance. The culture was pervasive. Estimates suggested that 90% of wrestlers in this era used steroids or other performance-enhancing drugs. The look simply was not achievable naturally for most people. The schedule was too demanding. The recovery time was too short. The expectations were too high. In 1988, nobody was asking questions. The bodies looked great on television. The merchandise sold. The fans cheered for the muscular heroes and booed the muscular villains. Everything seemed fine, but the bill would come due. In 1991, Dr. Zahorian was convicted of illegally distributing steroids to 37 WWE wrestlers and 43 professional wrestlers overall. The investigation revealed that he had shipped drugs to wrestlers via Federal Express, creating a paper trail that prosecutors used against him. Drugs were being delivered to Vince McMahon's office at Titan Towers in Stamford, Connecticut. Federal investigators began looking at the company itself. A grand jury was convened in 1992 to examine whether WWE management had conspired to distribute steroids to its performers. By 1993, Vince McMahon was indicted on charges of conspiracy to distribute steroids. The government alleged that McMahon had required wrestlers to take steroids and had facilitated their distribution. The trial in 1994 nearly destroyed everything McMahon had built. Hulk Hogan testified under immunity, acknowledging that he had used steroids for over a decade, but denying that McMahon had directly provided them. Other wrestlers testified about the culture of drug use within the company. McMahon was ultimately acquitted on all charges. The jury deliberated for 16 hours before returning a not guilty verdict. The judge had already dismissed some charges for insufficient evidence, but the damage was done. The scandal tarnished WWE's brand for years. The family-friendly image they had cultivated was undermined by stories of drug abuse and federal investigations. Advertisers grew nervous. Television networks grew nervous. The mainstream acceptance they had achieved in 1988 evaporated. The steroid culture that flourished in 1988 had planted a time bomb that exploded years later. The push for bigger and bigger bodies, the pressure to look superhuman, the willingness to ignore health consequences for visual impact. All of it traced back to the standards established during the company's peak years. The final curse was perhaps the most dangerous because it affected how the company thought about itself. In 1988, WWE faced no real competition. The National Wrestling Alliance and its affiliated territories had been decimated by McMahon's national expansion over the previous 4 years. Jim Crockett Promotions, the biggest remaining rival, was struggling financially after years of trying to compete. The American Wrestling Association, once a major promotion based in the upper Midwest under Verne Gagne, was dying in real time. They had lost their television deals and their major stars. The company that had helped launch Hulk Hogan's career was now an afterthought. Other regional territories had already closed or were on their last legs. The territorial system that had governed professional wrestling for decades was finished. McMahon had won. WWE stood alone at the top of the wrestling world. In October 1988, Ted Turner purchased Jim Crockett Promotions through a subsidiary called Universal Wrestling Corporation. The deal was completed on November 2nd. Turner renamed the company World Championship Wrestling, or WCW, after the flagship television show that had aired on his TBS network for years. At the time, few people saw this as a serious threat. Turner had purchased the company primarily to keep wrestling programming on his cable networks. The shows drew consistent ratings. They were inexpensive to produce. They filled time slots that would otherwise need to be programmed with something else. From Turner's perspective, it was a practical business decision. WCW was a money-losing operation. The company had nearly collapsed under Jim Crockett's leadership despite running good wrestling shows. Their creative was often chaotic. Their business practices were questionable. They had tried to compete directly with WWE and failed repeatedly. Nobody imagined that Ted Turner might decide to seriously challenge McMahon. Why would he? He was a media mogul with far bigger concerns than professional wrestling. He owned cable networks, news channels, and movie studios. Wrestling was a tiny part of his empire, but Turner had resources that dwarfed what WWE could access. He owned television networks that could provide unlimited airtime for wrestling programming. He had deep pockets that could fund years of losses while building a competitive product. He could outbid McMahon for talent if he chose to do so. Turner also held a grudge against McMahon dating back to disputes over television time slots in the mid-1980s. The two men had clashed repeatedly over the years. Their conflict had gotten personal. WWE of 1988 was not preparing for any of this. They were too busy counting their money and celebrating their success. They had no contingency plan for serious competition because they could not imagine it happening. Corporate arrogance had set in. The dangerous belief that the company's success was inevitable rather than earned. The assumption that what worked today would work forever. The conviction that nobody could challenge their dominance. This complacency bred lazy thinking. Why innovate when the current approach generates record revenue? Why develop new stars when the existing stars are selling tickets? Why worry about the future when the present is so profitable? WWE stopped being hungry. They stopped thinking about how to get better. They stopped preparing for challenges that might come. This would cost them dearly when the challenges finally arrived. The curses planted in 1988 did not reveal themselves immediately. The company continued to thrive through 1989 and into 1990. Business remained strong. Attendance stayed high. The formula kept working, but the damage was already done. The decay was just not visible yet. In 1989, the Mega Powers exploded at WrestleMania IV. Hogan defeated Savage to win the championship. The match drew massive business. The storytelling had been excellent over the previous year. Everything went according to plan. But then came the creative vacuum. Nobody else was ready to step into the spotlight. The roster had been so thoroughly structured around Hogan that there was no clear direction once the Savage feud ended. Who would challenge Hogan next? Who had been built up enough to seem like a credible threat? The answer is more complicated than you think. But that's a story for another time. What if the World Wrestling Federation had used 1988 differently? What if they had recognized their success as an opportunity rather than a destination? What if they had asked the hard questions while they still had time to address them? They could have built multiple main event stars while Hogan was still hot. Instead of keeping everyone in supporting roles, they could have elevated wrestlers who could eventually replace him. Randy Savage could have been positioned as a true equal rather than a sidekick. The $1 Million Man could have been built as a genuine threat. Jake Roberts could have been given main event programs. They could have rotated fresh matchups to prevent audience fatigue. Instead of the same formula repeated endlessly, they could have experimented with different storytelling approaches. Some matches could have ended differently. Some villains could have won occasionally. Some heroes could have faced setbacks that were not immediately overcome. They could have developed long-term storytelling that did not depend on one man's narrative. Multiple compelling storylines could have run simultaneously, giving fans reasons to tune in even when Hogan was not on screen. The tag team division could have been elevated. The Intercontinental Championship could have meant more. They could have invested in proper talent development. They could have created a system for identifying and training the next generation of stars. They could have planned for the post-Hogan era while Hogan was still generating massive revenue, building his successors before they were needed. They could have addressed the steroid issue before it became a crisis. They could have established wellness policies. They could have created a culture where looking superhuman was appreciated but not required for success. Performers could have been judged on their total package rather than just their physique. But they did none of these things. Success breeds complacency. When everything works, why change anything? When profits break records, why question the formula? When you are on top of the world, why worry about falling? Short-term thinking blinded them to long-term consequences. Vince McMahon believed in his own genius, and the spectacular results of 1988 reinforced that belief. Every choice he made seemed to turn to gold. Every gamble paid off. Every risk was rewarded. Why would he doubt himself when everything proved him right? The curse was not that they failed in 1988. The curse was that they succeeded so completely. They stopped imagining that failure was possible. They stopped preparing for challenges. They stopped evolving. The very formula that made them unstoppable made them rigid. They could not adapt when circumstances changed because they had spent years convincing themselves that circumstances would never change. By the time they realized something was wrong, reversing course required more than they could manage. The habits were too ingrained. The dependency was too complete. The arrogance was too deep. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Until next time.